Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of the Ontario Coaches Conference and today's second session, What Are You Thinking? Creating a Reflective Practice Through the Thinking Aloud Method. A few housekeeping items for you before we get started. This session will run until approximately 3:15 p.m. You may use the public session chat on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions to be read aloud at the end of the presentation. If at any time you need assistance, you can contact the CAO team by using the chat box in the bottom left corner of your screen that says Contact the CAO, and a member of CAO will get back to you. Today's session is being recorded and will be available for viewing within 24 hours from the Sessions tab. Today, we are excited to bring to you Dr. Amy Whitehead, an Associate Professor in Sports Psychology and Coaching at Liverpool John Moores University, UK. Her research focuses on the use of Think Aloud to understand athlete and coach cognition and how Think Aloud can be used as a reflective practice tool for coaches. Dr. Whitehead is also a sport and exercise psychologist accredited with the British Psychological Society and currently works as a consultant with a variety of athletes and sports. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Whitehead. Over to you, Amy.
Many thanks, Eric, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. As Eric just mentioned, hi from the UK. I'm from Liverpool John Moores University. I'm an associate professor there in sports psychology and coaching, and hopefully over the next kind of hour, 60 to 65 minutes, I'll introduce you to a new concept that maybe you've heard of, or possibly, or hopefully it's something new for you to take away today. So the concept is Think Aloud. But before we kind of jump into Think Aloud, we will be looking at considerations for reflective practice, for you as a coach to consider how you currently reflect. Also thinking about why it's important that we kind of focus on reflection in action rather than always focusing on reflection after the event. And then also thinking about, as coaches, what do we remember from our experiences? So I'll introduce you to Think Aloud as a concept, as a reflective method. I'll also talk to you a little bit about some of the earlier research that we've done with athletes. So you can kind of get two aims or two outcomes from this webinar. Hopefully you can kind of get a few ideas around how it might be useful to use with your athletes. But the majority of the session is thinking about reflective practice for you as a coach, and to think about how you might develop as a reflective practitioner. I'll have a few, I'll leave kind of 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. So please do feel free to ask any questions, be critical, or suggest kind of different ways that you might use or consider using Think Aloud. I'm always open to feedback and new ideas. So first question for you, and obviously this is a one-way presentation, but just get you thinking, how do you currently reflect? So do you kind of jot down your reflections after a session? A lot of coaches that I work with talk about reflecting in the car on the way home, or they might have what we call reflective conversations. And a lot of coaches, or pretty much every coach I've ever worked with, always says, of course I reflect, I'm always reflecting. But for me, the big question is, what are you changing as a result of that reflection? And how can you evidence these reflections and these actions as a result of reflecting kind of purposefully, reflecting critically? And what do you reflect on? And that's kind of the premise of today's session, thinking about you as a reflective practitioner and thinking about how you might be able to develop that kind of the next time you go into a coaching session. I have to credit kind of Daniel Kahneman's work because I think the whole premise and kind of theoretical underpinnings come from Daniel Kahneman's work around this concept of experiencing versus remembering. So if you haven't seen it, there's a really good TED Talk where Daniel Kahneman talks about how we experience kind of life and what we remember about life. And if you watch it, you might think, well, this hasn't got anything to do with coaching, but it links hugely into what I'm going to talk about today. And I've kind of borrowed some of Daniel's slides from his TED Talk, so I'm just going to credit him for that. But he talks about these two types of selves. And he talks about the experiencing self and the remembering self. And the experiencing self is kind of how we experience every second within the day, within the experience. So kind of how are you experiencing this session right now? Hopefully positively. But then we also have the remembering self, and this is about what we decide to keep with, and what we decide to maintain about our experiences. So most of the time, what we tend to remember is more about how we feel at the end of an event. Also, when we reflect and we think about our memories, we often reflect on critical moments. So what are these things that we kind of keep hold of, and what are the things that we reflect on, or we might dwell on or think back to? But the problem here is kind of, what are we not remembering from the experience? What are we deciding to keep, and why are we deciding to keep that? So Daniel Kahneman talks about this being a cognitive trap, and one of the reasons for that is because we can be having a great experience, but if the kind of the end feeling isn't positive, then we might not remember that experience as a positive experience. So an example I always give is kind of 3 days ago, you could have been having the worst day of your life, and then at the very end of the day, or you could have been having a bad day, but at the very end of the day, someone could give you $1 million. I was going to say pounds. Either or, it's still a pretty cool thing to happen. But then if I ask you about that day 3 days ago, you might say it was the best day ever, someone gave me £1 million. But actually, up until that event, you might not have been having a nice experience. So your memory of the day was positive, but the actual experience wasn't so. And that's where we need to think about how we reflect as coaches and what we are actually reflecting on. So here's a little kind of, I mentioned that I'd kind of borrowed some of his TED Talk, and some of you might have seen this. But a really nice example that Daniel Kahneman kind of shows us is this patient example. So you've got two patients, patient A and patient B, both undergoing a very similar procedure. It's quite painful, and every 60 seconds, each patient is asked to report their kind of pain levels or how much they're suffering. So if we can see patient A and we can see patient B, and we can see the duration of that procedure is different. So I think Eric's going to keep an eye out for this, but if you can pop in the chat, which patient do you think suffered the most, patient A or patient B?
Great. So as Amy said there, you guys everyone here can use the chat. Let us know, patient A or patient B. We'll give that a few seconds.
Have we got any responses?
Got a couple coming in. A, couple B's.
Yeah.
A with a question marks. B, more B's.
Okay.
Looking like B's.
A, B. All right, cool. Here we go. There's loads more coming in.
Looking like B's. I'll throw it back to you, Amy.
Thank you. Okay, so whoever put down patient B, you're right. But most of the time, the answer I get is patient A. Sorry, ignore me. Patient B is correct. The person who suffered the most, is patient A. And although patient B might have looked like they endured kind of a longer procedure and kind of more pain over time, when asked how much did these patients think they suffered, patient A reports suffering the most because of how they felt at the end of the event. So again, it goes back to this experiencing versus remembering. So what we could argue is patient B's experience was worse than patient B's experience was worse than patient A, but patient A's memory of the experience was worse patient A's experience was worse than patient B's because of how they felt at the very end of that procedure. So I quite like that as a neat example to highlight this kind of experiencing versus remembering. Yeah, sorry, Sasha. Patient A is the right answer. Patient A reported suffering more. Sorry for the confusion there. Okay, so how does this link to reflective practice? So if we are thinking about the traditional methods, so how does coach education, and I'm kind of talking mostly from my experiences in the UK, but a lot of the coach education kind of courses that people go on and the way that reflective practice has traditionally been taught is very much kind of retrospective, reflective diaries, journals, even kind of reflective conversations after the event. So it's always happening after the event, and it's always we're always reflecting on the memory. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Of course, reflection on action, which comes after the event, is very important. It's very important that, you know, sometimes we might not have them light bulb moments until days, weeks, even a year later when we think, oh, well, yeah, I remember that experience and this is what I've learned from it. But my question is kind of what are we reflecting on, what are we keeping? So what does the remembering self keep? And kind of what experiences might we be losing? And that's where Think Aloud comes in. So Think Aloud is a simple concept, and it's originated from cognitive psychology, where researchers, kind of psychologists, scientists ask participants to kind of verbalize their thoughts out loud as they solve a task. Now, I'll talk to you a little bit in a couple of minutes about some early research that I've done with athletes. But when I work with coaches, I ask these coaches to verbalize their thoughts during a coaching session out loud, where possible, because I appreciate it's not always possible to do that. But where they can, I ask them to step back and use Think Aloud as a reflective practice tool. So coaches are thinking aloud whilst delivering a session, and what they're doing then is recording this experience in self. Hopefully it helps us to capture the experience and add it to the memory, but it also stops us from ignoring some of the experiences that we would rather forget. And sometimes them experiences are the ones that we need to work on the most. So just to kind of reiterate, Think Aloud is wherein I'll talk about the technologies later on as well, but traditionally we just use little clip mics that the coaches attach to their collar. They then either use their mobile phones or a dictaphone, which goes in the pocket. And where possible, they then step back and just verbalize kind of what they're thinking, and then they reflect on that. So they explain what they're thinking. And again, I'll go into more detail, but I get coaches to ask the question of why. Why am I doing this? Or why have I set up the session in that way? Or, you know, why have I just communicated or given that feedback to the athlete? So it's the constant questioning of why. What Think Aloud does as well is it creates this element of awareness and this metacognition, or thinking about thinking, and constantly gets the coach to become a little bit more self-aware and to check and challenge some of them habits or behaviours that they might not usually be aware of. And like I've mentioned earlier, Think Aloud originally, for me as a researcher and as a sports psychologist and a pro-academic, as I usually call it, started kind of 12 years ago when I started my PhD. And I wanted to know kind of how can we gain an insight into athletes' thought processes as they perform their sport. So I looked at golfers, we mic'd golfers up, and as they played, we asked them to verbalize their thoughts kind of out loud. I was kind of far enough away that I couldn't hear a word they were saying. And then we could analyze that thought process. We could kind of delve deeper into some of their kind of processes, some of their maybe less effective or beneficial behaviors. From a research perspective, we could look at differences between experts and novices and differences between practice and competition. And then from an applied sports psychology perspective, I can use this to help my athlete become more aware of their thought processes and maybe put some interventions in place. So from a research perspective, we've been able to apply Think Aloud to a wide range of different sports and athletes. I'll only talk about a couple of these today because we'll jump back into coaching in 5 minutes' time. But we've used Think Aloud to look at tennis players, to assess how tennis players cope or experience stress and then cope with stress. We've looked at how cyclists pace and kind of what they think about at different time points during a time trial. Again, we've been able to look at cricket batters and bowlers and look at the differences between what causes them stress and again how they might cope with that. We've looked at, well, a colleague of mine has looked at elite snooker players and again looked at what stresses they experience and how they cope. And then in golf, which is predominantly kind of where my early work came from, we've looked at things like patterns and behaviours, how a golfer might dwell on past shots and how that has a negative effect on performance. I've put the gymnast in there. We haven't mic'd up gymnasts while they're kind of doing a million tumble turns and routines, but we've used it with gymnastics judges to look at like the difference between experts and novices and whether we can gain an insight into expert decision making or cognitive processes and what novice judges just starting out can learn from that. I'll just play you a little audio file from a golfer that I've worked with, not Tiger Woods, just to mention, and just to give you a real insight into what kind of things might be said and what it might sound like.
Right, let's go. Okay, first hole, par 5, up the hill. My focus point here off the tee is going to be that path up the right-hand side. That'll be a good line into the flag as well. Okay, peg it up on the left side of the tee box to give me the best angle. Okay, just go through my pre-shot routine. Concentrate on what I've been working on. Nothing. Right, okay. It's kind of not a bad shot, down the right a little. First shot in anger for a while, so I'll take that. We're off and running.
So what you can see there, for example, is he talks about his pre-performance routine. He obviously he doesn't verbalize his thoughts actually during the execution of the shot because we wouldn't recommend that. But then he kind of evaluates the outcome of his shot. What we also get within golf is what they think about between shots and whether they're switching on and switching off and when they set up for the next shot. So it's quite interesting to map out kind of the whole course management. 18 holes can be quite daunting. So usually when I'm working with golfers, a lot of the data we've collected, we've only done it over 6 holes. And then when we've looked at kind of golf and what this data might give us, one of the first studies I ever did, because the question is like, why think aloud? And this goes back to the experiencing versus remembering self. I did a study to compare what golfers are telling me during Think Aloud and during performance. And then I interviewed them afterwards and asked them to talk me through each shot that they played and kind of the thoughts and feelings that they had during that. And the biggest thing that stuck out to me is that the retrospective accounts of each shot were very, very much dependent on the outcome. So, for example, I always use this example because I was kind of a couple, like 30 meters behind the golfer. He hits the ball and he starts swearing. He's really unhappy with his shot. And he can't see where it's landed, but he feels like he's sliced it. He doesn't know where it is because it's kind of gone around the dog leg on the golf course. Anyway, he's not happy. So his Think Aloud is very negative. We actually get to the ball and it's just in the rough, but not in a too bad of position. And he's then able to chip onto the green. And I think he finished that hole with a par. So when I asked him retrospectively, can you recall that shot? It was much more positive because the outcome he was really happy with. So the Think Aloud data and the interview data were very kind of different in terms of the information that I was getting from the athlete. And the retrospective interviews were very much based on the outcome of the shot, rather than because that's what he remembers, that's what he's decided to keep, which isn't a bad thing. It's just from an information perspective, and to kind of capture the experience, we can't necessarily capture it all the time retrospectively. And then from an expert novice perspective, we can see that within the Think Aloud data, high skilled performers are very much externally focused. So gathering information about their environment, how far to the pin, what direction is the wind in, and then what kind of shot am I going to play. Whereas our novices are very technical, step-by-step mechanisms of performance. And that's kind of obvious, right? But we can see them clear differences through the Think Aloud audio. I've just got another clip of the golfer just so you can get more of an idea.
I've been thinking about my chipping a fair bit, even though I haven't been practicing it. Right, second tee, we're up on the proper tee here. Again on a temporary green, short of the proper green. So the hole's normally 284 yards. But they've got the flag playing as a par 3. So they've got it back at 218, it is down there. Slightly downhill, slightly down breeze. Pin's really on the left side of the fairway with fairly heavy rough to the left of that. So left would not be good. That's why I'm going to tee it up on the left side of the tee box. I don't want to go left. It'll give me the feeling that I'm hitting a little bit away from the trouble. And I'm going to aim for the tree, which is about 5-6 yards to the right of the flag. Because my tendency is to hit a little draw. Okay, down this wind. I think a good 4 in.
So I hope you can understand Geordie, which is the northeast of England. But you'll see there that this player is quite high level, but he's quite analytical, and he's really kind of can't decide between what type of club he's going to use. And that was something that we worked on together from an applied perspective. He would literally think about every possible option, every possible solution, but he was very externally focused. And then just to give you a quick overview of some of the work we've done in cycling, what we can see in cycling are the things that we can look at are how does a cyclist think over time? So what are the things that are being verbalized at different time points over a 10-mile time trial? So most of the work we've done, and again, this is kind of a limitation or something to be aware of, is that it's quite difficult to get someone to think aloud over like a 50-mile race, for example, or ride. So most of the research that's been done has been done kind of within a 30-minute-ish time frame, but over a 10-mile time trial. And we can see kind of how our thoughts might fluctuate during an event. So for example, if you are a runner or a cyclist or doing any type of endurance activity, think about what you might be thinking at different time points, kind of beginning, middle and end. And for example, from an applied perspective, if I was working as a sports psychologist with a particular cyclist, I could look at maybe why they're verbalizing a lot of things around pain and discomfort in the third quartile, and look at whether that links to their pace, their power output, their kind of heart rate, and what's going on between our physiological measures, our performance outcomes, and what they're verbalizing. So kind of connecting cognition and action. But jumping back into coaching, and this is kind of the main kind of focus of today's session, and when I was kind of doing a lot of that early research, which I still do a lot of, but specifically the golf work, golfers were coming off the course, and sometimes they'd say to me, wow, I've realised how negative I am, or wow, I've realised this is my thought process. And without kind of, it's not supposed to make them more aware, and it's because there's different levels of Think Aloud that we haven't really got time to get into today. But asking a participant just to verbalise what they're thinking shouldn't disrupt them too much, but it's when we ask them to explain what they're thinking that kind of what we're asking them to do is retrieve information from the long-term memory. However, some of these golfers were coming off the course and becoming more aware of their thought process. And obviously, I work in coaching. I teach on a coaching program within the university, and there's always this talk about reflective practice, and a lot of our students were never keen on it. It was quite time intensive, etc. And I just thought, how can we apply Think Aloud to coaches? Can it be used to help the reflective process? Can it be used to help coaches become more aware? And that's where we did the initial Think Aloud program with rugby league coaches. And I'll talk you through kind of the process that we went through there. I'll also talk you through a kind of a single case study paper that we published last year. And this was a single soccer coach using Think Aloud, and kind of he reflected on that process. So I deliver a lot of these Think Aloud programs as coach development CPD, and it's important to kind of emphasize that although any one of you now could go away and use Think Aloud, you could kind of take part of this process and definitely get a lot from it. What I also do is scaffold this with kind of these workshops, these reflective conversations with a group of coaches. So I worked with a specific group of coaches for this project at a rugby club in the UK. I'm not sure if you have rugby league in Canada. I think it's mostly rugby union, but rugby league is a big sport in the northwest of England. We introduced these coaches to Think Aloud. We took them through a familiarisation process, because as you can imagine, if I'm asking coaches to verbalise their thoughts, think aloud during a session, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's definitely going to kind of cause a little bit of anxiety, possibly some apprehension, and it's not a natural process to initially engage in. So it's really important that we go through this kind of familiarisation process. Once we've kind of done an initial workshop, introduce coaches to it, I then give coaches a click mic and a dictaphone and ask them to use Think Aloud where possible within their coaching sessions. And one of the good things about this specific project was a lot of the coaches team coached, so there was two of them together. So often while one coach was kind of giving feedback or setting up a session, the other coach was able to step back and use Think Aloud really effectively. I have since used it in environments where coaches don't co-coach, but it's still been kind of really useful and been possible to do. So kind of step 2 is where they go out and use it. Step 3 is where I ask coaches to listen back. And I'll show you a set of questions next that I ask coaches to kind of use as a reflective process. And I think using this reflection in action heightens awareness in step 2, but listening back also allows you to listen back to your thoughts of the experience and kind of reflect on your in-action reflections. It gets a bit confusing, I know. And then bring coaches kind of back into a workshop, and then coaches will share their reflections on their audio. Now, some coaches will bring their audio and share it with other coaches in the group, or they'll share it with myself, and they'll, ask for my thoughts and feedback. But it's really important here that I acknowledge that we're not, I always want coaches to not think that it's a surveillance mechanism. We're not using this to kind of listen in and critique these coaches, and it's very personal to them. To verbalise your thoughts and your honest verbalisations, you have to be quite vulnerable. You have to be quite trusting in others that you're going to share that with. So it's really important that whoever I'm working with feels comfortable to share. And if they don't feel comfortable, they don't have to share, but they'll share their reflections just kind of verbally with the rest of the group. And what tends to happen is, I won't say we develop a community of practice, but we develop this kind of shared reflection group, and the group becomes support for one another. Now, this process can be run multiple times depending on kind of time and who I'm working with. But I think I worked with one NGB in the UK, national governing body, and we ran this kind of cycle 3 times over the space of kind of 5 to 6 months. And we looked at how kind of the coach's reflections could develop from being very descriptive, and then we kind of went more in depth to consider kind of critical reflection. So, for example, a coach would describe kind of what they see initially when they use Think Aloud, but as they get more comfortable with it, they will start to then reflect on their feelings. They will start to evaluate what's in front of them more. And also what starts to happen is, rather than just describing what's happening in terms of their players, they start to reflect on themselves. So what is it about me that is affecting this training session? What is it about my feedback and the way I've set this session up and my body language that affects how this session is going and how that player might be enjoying or not enjoying or developing within my session? So that process does take a little bit of time, and it's important to remember that the first time, if you are to try and use Think Aloud, the first time is always quite, well, a little bit uncomfortable. But I always encourage coaches just to have a go kind of at home, or when they're watching a game on TV, or even when you're boiling the kettle and making a hot drink, just have a little practice thinking aloud. These are kind of some quotes from coaches that have used Think Aloud. These are actually Think Aloud quotes from some of the transcripts that we've taken. So you can see here on the left, the coach says, maybe I've been a bit mean on them. I'm making a comparison to scholarship players, which these guys aren't yet. I need to think about toning myself down a little. So he's kind of like describing that he's being mean. He's evaluating why he's being mean, and then he's talking about what he might change as a result of that. Again, there's a second one there. Communication's excellent, and because of that, they're working together. It's just some little unforced errors that the opposition have been looking to get away with. Based on this, I'm not going to say anything at the minute. And although that sounds very simple, that's something that we look at and we talk about quite a lot here. So a lot of the discussions that we have with coaches is, how often do we step in? How often do we give feedback? And a lot of the kind of Think Aloud reflections that I'm listening to are very much around, you know what, I don't need to step in here, I'm just going to let them play. Or do I need to step in? Right, this is happening. I've seen this happen too many times. Right, I'm going to jump in now and give feedback. So there's that constant kind of questioning of whether that's needed or not. And then there's 2 more there. One coach talks about his communication. So I don't think player X was actually listening to me there. Need to think about how I communicate better next time. And then, so I have picked kind of non-sweary quotes, because you can imagine in the golf examples as well, there was kind of some bad language. But here's one: apologies for the language, but feeling a little bit out of my depth. This whole session seems to be going downhill. So again, I think that the one on the right there, for me, is a coach who has used Think Aloud a couple of times and is just becoming more comfortable with the honesty of his verbalizations. So these are the questions that I ask coaches to think about once they've kind of used Think Aloud and when they're listening back. And these are the questions that I ask them to kind of bring to the workshop after they've used it. You could use any kind of reflective practice models. So we used Gibbs in the 2006 paper, and I've just kind of simplified this a little bit. But what we kind of ask the coaches is, what is it that you are thinking aloud about? What is it that you're reflecting on? And what do you observe about yourself just by initially listening back? Once you've kind of established, you know, the main things that you think are coming out from this audio, Then think about why. So why do you reflect on this? And sometimes we reflect on things, and then when we question why, we actually go, actually, I don't need to be thinking about that, or that's not really relevant. I've put too much emphasis on this thing that's actually not having an impact or hasn't got any relevance to the session or the outcomes or the aims. And when we kind of get through kind of 2 or 3 workshops, we start to question coaches more about who they are as individuals. So it's difficult for them to do this during a coaching session and when they're using Think Aloud. But I think scaffolding these questions are really important. So why do you coach the way you do? And what is it about you as a person, you as a coach, and your development that kind of links to what you're reflecting on and what you're thinking about during a coaching session? Once you've thought about that, it's really important to then go, well, how is this reflection, how are these thoughts impacting on the coaching session? Is it having a benefit? Great. If not, how is it having a negative effect on the session? And then the really important thing of reflection, because it's important that things change or you decide what to keep. What next? So based on that whole kind of what, why, and how, what are you going to change and what you're going to keep? Because obviously reflection only occurs with thoughtful action. So hopefully that'll kind of give you an idea of maybe just questioning yourself now as a coach. We're going to jump to the whys a little bit more, and I'll give you an example from a project I'm working on at the minute with a group of tennis coaches, where we've really delved deep into these questionings of who these coaches are as people and how does that align to them as coaches, and then how does that look from a Think Aloud perspective. So again, going to the why. So and question yourself now. So why do you behave or coach the way that you do? So if we delve deeper into critical reflection, you would consider things like, well, how have you developed as a person? How have you developed as a coach? And something that is quite big for me and is quite poignant in terms of what coaches learn from Think Aloud is become really aware of these biases, and they become aware of certain players that they might be giving more attention to than others. They become aware of what mood they might turn up to in some sessions compared to others, and why that might be. And then considering all of that, who am I? How does that impact on your coaching? How does that impact on your coaching day to day? How does that impact on your relationship with your players? How does it impact on your relationship with your coaching team? So they're quite big questions, and it's not something that you will have answers to maybe right now, but maybe just something to go away and think about. And this is kind of all part of the Think Aloud program. So again, it's not just using Think Aloud, it's then digging in deep and thinking, why am I verbalizing that? What is it about me that's led to that verbalization? And then the big one, as I've just mentioned, is what next? So what will you change? And as I've just mentioned, self-reflection is only useful when followed by thoughtful action. So this is a little example from the another paper that we published last year. And this was one coach, soccer, if you're from your side of the pond, football from our side. And this coach used Think Aloud over 4 consecutive coaching sessions. And he also used a reflective diary. It was part of his a project within his masters, and he wanted to see if Think Aloud could improve his coaching, and he wanted to understand kind of what are the benefits of it. And the 5 boxes there are the main themes that came out from the project. So as I've already mentioned, and as some of them other quotes kind of alluded to, he developed this increased level of awareness. And because he became more aware, he was able to improve his communication, improve how he spoke to his athletes, how he gave feedback, how often he gave feedback. And he also talks about this element of improved pedagogy. So his coaching practice, how he designs his sessions, how he modifies his sessions, and thinks about the aims and the objectives. But it's really important to mention that there was 2 kind of limitations or things that he noticed as a result of using it. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge the limitations of anything, just so that everyone is completely open and clear, and when they're starting a new tool or a new project. And one of them things was he was experienced quite a lot of apprehension or worry at the start of using Think Aloud. And during the use of Think Aloud, and again, this goes back to something I said earlier, he used Think Aloud over 4 consecutive coaching sessions, and it became a little bit of a distraction. So actually, he became quite obsessed and internalized with his thoughts processes. He became quite hung up on what he was thinking and thinking about his thinking, that there was a few kind of instances where he missed some of the things going on the pitch. So we talk about Think Aloud as a distraction. And from this paper, we recommend that if you are going to use it, don't use it consecutively, session after session. Give yourself a week break between each kind of Think Aloud session, just to give yourself a break from it. And I only recommend coaches use it I recommend they use it spaced out, so that you're just using it to check and challenge your coaching process and your behaviours. And here's another kind of coach that's used it in this very similar context, and he's provided a little bit of an overview of kind of his experiences and what he's learned from this process.
So my experiences of using Think Aloud started a few years ago now. I've been engrossing myself into the reflective practice literature and looking at models such as Gibbs and the traditional reflection on action, and the models that Coach Education signposted you to when I did my qualifications. And it was when I was reading this literature I then came across Think Aloud. And this novel approach gave me the opportunity to develop my self-awareness. It also gave me the opportunity to develop my pedagogical skills and also my communication, in particular being able to communicate with players and also be able to talk openly and honestly about how I'm feeling. I was able to adapt my sessions in action to ensure the players were getting the best possible experience, and I was able to focus on the holistic development of players within the session better. It allows me to focus on the dynamic nature of coaching, and depending on the context in which I'm working. Now, Think Aloud did come with some challenges for me. There was these feelings of distraction. What I mean by distraction is there were often key moments within the session that I would miss, and I felt like I was having a negative impact on the player's experience because I was verbalizing my own thought processes. Now, this is something and a challenge that I've really worked on in recent years, and I've been able to have a massive impact on the experience of the players, but also the development of the players through the use of reflecting on my sessions and this reflected in action method. And that's what it does. It gives you the opportunity to reflect in action. My current job is a dual role as a teacher and as a coach. And the biggest strength and the biggest thing that I've learned is you can use Think Aloud to reflect on moments in your everyday teaching, in your everyday coaching. And this is why I'll continue to use this to evaluate my planning, my delivery, and also my reflective processes.
So a few kind of testimonials from different coaches that have used it, and I've got another one at the end from a coach that I've worked with in Northern Ireland who calls Think Aloud her virtual coach developer. She talks about kind of having a little coach developer on her shoulder, and she's kind of verbalizing her thoughts to this imaginary person. So I've just started working with a tennis academy, and we've got kind of 3 coaches who are coaching tennis, and we've got 2 S&C coaches within that group. And we've taken a very similar process to the 2006 Rugby League paper that I've just explained to you. So we've been going through some initial kind of workshops and looking at kind of values and philosophy and looking at what these coaches want to develop through the use of Think Aloud. And they've only just started using it recently, and they've provided me with 2 audio clips of them using Think Aloud actually in the coaching session. So what you'll hear here is you'll hear some player playing tennis in the background, and then you'll hear possibly the coach kind of giving feedback and then reflecting on that feedback process.
Thinking aloud after intervening with Abby. Obviously, taking part in a really tough drill, if the first ball is not effective, then she automatically loses the point. She's in a defensive situation. Obviously really struggling, but my sense was that letting her talk about how she was feeling and verbalizing that did help in that moment. So we'll see how she does right now, but she seems to have a better look of focus and more positive look about her right now.
So one of the things this coach has been working on as well is how to be more autonomy supportive, and allowing kind of the athlete to have input into the session. And prior to his feedback there, or his reflections, he was actually using different type of questioning also, and looking at whether certain question, the way he asked certain questions, like link to the athlete responding in different ways. Here's another example.
I'd say that your line balls at the minute are 50-50 success. The 50 that are in are brilliant, but it's decide if you're happy with 50-50. I left him to go through that for a little while there, but I was convinced that he wasn't seeing that part of the error was the fact he was going line off the first ball. So as much as he was right, like he was missing them and only just, and fairly making a decent fist of making it, I feel like he was blinded there to the fact that the higher success rate was cross, and particularly in these sorts of moments like there was a good response, and he's listened. Great chase. That was a better way to go. That's really good response, Alex. Smart. Again, even though you lost the point. Yeah. Interesting moments now, because I wanted to be clear with him on the decision making, but mental stuff here he's got to handle. So I'm permitting the sort of negative response, but I need him to energy up now before the next point and look athletic, which is not too bad, so I'll leave him to roll. And he's really listening now about the cross, which to me shows he's in a better headspace, so I don't want to do anything to wreck that rhythm for him and just let him roll.
So what you'll hopefully have heard there is the reflection on kind of allowing the player to be the decision maker, and kind of that he's listened to his feedback and he's made the change based on his feedback, so then he doesn't need to step in again. So again, just reflecting on the feedback that is given and whether or not you need to give more or kind of step back. And that's just kind of a 1 to 2 minute clip from a 1 hour session. So they're the kind of audio reflections that we get, and this was kind of the first or second time these coaches were using Think Aloud. And I just want to kind of emphasize that the academy that I'm working with, Cultivate Academy, in the UK, Tennis Academy, is an elite tennis academy, and one of the first conversations that we had in an initial workshop were, what are your values as a club, as an academy? How does this link to your values as a coach? How does this also link to your values as a person? And then what does that then look like from a coaching behavior perspective? And then again, what can this look like from a Think Aloud perspective? So what we're trying to do is connect all the dots, connect our values to who we are as a person and a coach, look at what that means in terms of coaching behaviors, and then maybe focusing on a couple of them coaching behaviors during a Think Aloud session. So for example, the conversation that we had last week was, if the communication was a big kind of element of the discussion, and the question was, well, what does communication look like? What does good communication look like in coaching practice? And we talked about things like asking certain questions that allow for athletes to respond, allowing for silence, knowing when to step in and when not to step in, and also like asking questions. And even if it's a little bit awkward, if the athlete's not responding to you, allow time for that to happen. So they're just some real basic examples of some of the conversations we had around communication, but they're the things that the coaches have gone away now to work on and reflect on during their Think Aloud kind of sessions over the next couple of weeks. And then kind of just to think about you as a coach today, the role of the coach, it's huge. So I'm sorry if the text is quite small and then some of you are unable to see it. But this is an old kind of reference from Vela 2011. And this paper looked at, well, what is the role of the coach? So I just wanted to highlight that the role of the coach is huge. Yeah, it's complex. There's a lot of responsibility on a coach's shoulders. And when we ask coaches to reflect, there's so many different things that they can reflect on. It can be quite overwhelming. So what I ask coaches to then think about is, what elements of your coaching behavior do you think that you need to kind of develop the most? You know, what is most important to you? And how can we go and develop that and include that within the reflective process when using Think Aloud? And one of the things we do then is performance profile. So this is a very common kind of sport psychology tool that we use when we sit down with our athletes, and we look at what are the characteristics of their sport to them, you know, what's most important to them in terms of their role or their athletic kind of position, etc. But I use this now also with coaches. So we get coaches to consider, and just to kind of go back a step, the reason I do this is because, and I usually maybe do this in like the second workshop, is because coaches go out and use Think Aloud and they come back with kind of 10 things that they've noticed about themselves. And then we need to think more kind of strategically, maybe narrow it down a little bit and think, right, how can we work on these individual elements? Because it's unfair to ask coaches to develop all of these things and reflect on all of these things within one coaching session. So like, how do we develop trust with our players? You know, how do we promote teamwork? How do we develop resilience? How do we develop team cohesion? How do we promote enjoyment and create a motivational climate? Yeah, like this is a lot to think about within one coaching session. And I know you'll think about it pre-session, but within the session, you know, are there things that you can be specific about and focus on that can help you kind of develop those areas more effectively? So by kind of listing your key characteristics or what you perceive to be kind of the most important parts of you as a coach, thinking about, you know, what the opposite quality might look like, and then rank ordering this in terms of importance, and then self-assess. So in terms of if you were using, I always say, think of the best coach in the world, and there are 10 out of 10 in all these areas. Where would you put yourself in terms of your self-assessment? You might also want to ask a colleague, or you know, someone who you know watches you coach to complete this as well. We're looking at kind of gaining different perspectives of us, but then looking at from when you've self-rated yourself on a kind of from 1 to 7, what are your lowest areas, and can you maybe use that as a focus when you're thinking aloud? So again, just something to think about you as a coach and your kind of main areas that you think you need to work on. I'm only going to play kind of half of this audio clip because it is quite long, and I've got one more to play for you after this, just because I want to kind of portray all the different messages from different athletes and coaches that I've worked with. Think Aloud can be used in different contexts. So Think Aloud's been used in strength and conditioning. And at first, a lot of people were kind of a little bit surprised by this. If you're working on one-to-one with an athlete, you know, you can't obviously verbalize what you're thinking as you stood right next to somebody. It might be a little bit unethical. You might say things that they don't want to hear. But there are opportunities where you can step back and verbalize kind of your reflections in terms of what you've just done within that session, and kind of reflect on general the general kind of flow of your session. So this is Graham. He's an S&C, strength and conditioning and development coach at Millfield Academy, which is a really high-performing sports academy within the UK, and he's kind of going to talk about how he's used Think Aloud within his context.
Okay, just as a quick introduction then, my name's Graham Williams. I'm lead practitioner and athletic development coach at Millfield School. Just as a bit more of an intro, Millfield is a large independent school based in the southwest of England. Millfield's got a rich history of development, particularly in the co-curricular as well as the academic domains. So the likes of sport, music, art, drama. Pupils have a kind of really good access to professional coaches, have flexibility within the academic timetables to continue their development in their passions and interests alongside their academic work. My role then is to lead on a practitioner group of sports scientists from various different stages and levels of their careers, from full-time experienced practitioners down to placement students and graduate coaches, and to implement and appropriately position sports science within the development journey of pupils from years 9, so 13 to 14, all the way through to upper 6th years at age 18. Amy asked me then just to share some of our experiences of using Think Aloud, particularly with our strength and conditioning practitioners. We first did this in 2017, I think, when we used one of Amy's papers as a catalyst for part of our sort of journal club and literature review, where we would share some thoughts and feedback on the paper. That then led us to try Think Aloud as a reflective practice tool ourselves. And then from then, every year we've embedded it as part of our sort of practitioner development program, where we spend a term exploring Think Aloud, reading papers, listening to the podcast that Amy's done, and trialing it ourselves, and continuing to sort of learn and develop from it. I think just a couple of take homes from me in terms of the impact it's had on us as a department. I think that absolutely it's been a catalyst for my development as a sort of supporting early years practitioners, but also those practitioners themselves in becoming more aware of their coaching practice, behaviours, their language, their position in the gym, how they engage with pupils, what they say, why they think what they do. Like, it's just acted as a starting point to enter into those discussions more deeply. I think one reason it's got really good traction for us is because of the novelty. So having worked in the field of strength and conditioning for a number of years, I'd never seen it being embedded into a practitioner development program or a coach education program, and therefore for us to use it with coaches, it's got that buy-in, it's got the novelty factor, and people want to have a go and engage and step in. When they do step in, I think initially there's some apprehension about trying to say the right things, about initially people end up kind of just describing what's in front of them. But eventually, after some reviews back into the papers and some of the framework that Amy's developed and shared, we start to learn to do it better. And then the outcomes are more rich and the impact on the pupil is more profound. So that journey through learning Think Aloud and using it effectively has been a really interesting journey to explore with our early years practitioners in the development program.
So hopefully
just as a quick
you can
introduction.
just see there kind of the different contexts in which Think Aloud can be used. I'm just conscious of time, and I did say I'd leave some time for questions. So just to kind of spend the last 5 minutes talking through some logistical things to consider. So technology obviously is very important. And originally in the early work that I did, we used clip mics and dictaphones. But more recently, with technology developing, the use of kind of mobile phones, earpods, wireless Bluetooth headphones, etc., has become kind of a really kind of useful tool. Most of the coaches I work with will use their own phones. One thing, some phones have like a dictate app, and that will transcribe it into text as well. So there are kind of ways around it. And some coaches who are doing like coach education programs have used it. It's typed up on the phone, and then they've been able to kind of submit that as part of some of their reflective processes within coach education programs. So again, there's different types of tech. In a cycling study, we used some glasses that had like a camera and an audio. They picked up audio. So there are, I'm sure you can think of new and different technology and be a little bit more innovative than me. I'm still kind of a bit of a dinosaur with my dictaphone. And then things to consider. So first things first, it's really important that we make others aware that we use and Think Aloud, especially our players, because sometimes they can then become a bit self-conscious and they might think that it's a method of surveillance and that you're talking about them. But just making people aware that it's for your own development. Making parents aware also is a really important thing, and I think that's come out in a lot of projects that I've done, and it's always something that we say up front, is to make parents aware that what you're doing is for your own development as a coach. I've noticed a comment about kind of stream of consciousness versus organised thoughts. So organised thoughts do happen, especially in the first time that the coaches will use it, because they're obviously becoming more aware. So they're starting to become more kind of organised in their thought process. And if anyone's familiar with like skill acquisition literature and how we progress and develop a skill, I see Think Aloud is exactly the same. So we go through this cognitive stage where we're thinking a lot, and it's kind of taking up a big chunk of our kind of working memory because we're tending to think aloud and the act of coaching. But once we practice it and we become better at it, it becomes a much more natural process, and we do start to get more natural thought processes rather than organised thoughts. Consider your location when using Think Aloud. Obviously, no brainer. The acoustics in kind of sports halls and gyms sometimes aren't great for using it. So again, just consider if people can hear you. And then when reflecting back, do feel free to adapt the reflective items that I've presented today. I think you might have your own kind of reflective questions. This is a question of like, what, so what, now what? That's used quite a lot in a lot of our coach education programs. Or you can kind of take Gibbs's model and go through them. I think is it like seven questions around descriptions, feelings, evaluations, analysis, conclusions, and actions. I think that's 6. So yeah, feel free to kind of adapt and play around with that yourself. And then some kind of take-home messages in that Think Aloud isn't something that you will use on a daily basis. As I've already mentioned, it could disrupt natural thought process. But it is important to kind of acknowledge that we do want to kind of disrupt that natural thought process, because we want to check and challenge what your kind of habits are, your coaching processes, your beliefs. And I want you to question that and just check that, you are coaching in the right way that you want to coach, and that you can become more aware of maybe some of these bad habits that you might have, or good habits as well, and that you can reinforce. And reflection comes from this idea of thinking about our thinking. So then once we've used Think Aloud and we've thought about our thinking, we then need to challenge that. And I've talked a lot about kind of using Think Aloud and maybe using it on your own. But one of the kind of, if we look at the coach education literature and the criticisms of reflective practice, it talks about how if we only do it on our own, who's challenging us and who's kind of breaking that kind of cycle or that bubble that we're in. So I'd always recommend, if you can, working with a mentor or a critical friend, and maybe sharing some of that Think Aloud audio, or just your thoughts, and being open to your thoughts being challenged. So final reflections, and these are from Fiona, who uses Think Aloud as her digital coach developer, and she used this quite recently. So Fiona's going to share her thoughts, and then I'm going to open the session up to questions.
Think Aloud has become an effective new addition to my coaching sessions and my match day routines. Through regular use, I have become more skilled in using Think Aloud. Initially, I had found myself commentating too much. I also found large gaps of silence in my recordings as I was forgetting to think aloud. But like anything new skill, the more you practice it, the better you become. And Think Aloud has now become a very valuable tool to me as a coach. I actually refer to it now as my new virtual assistant coach and my virtual coach developer. It's very easily set up. All I needed was my mobile phone, a headset with the recording device, and I downloaded a voice recorder app. One thing I will advise people is let other people know that's going to be involved in the sessions, that you are using the Think Aloud process, so that they don't think you're crazy talking to yourself on the sideline. But by verbalizing your thoughts during your sessions and your games, by stepping back and observing why you're doing things, are you happy with what you're saying? You're able then to make those adjustments and changes instantly. You're reflecting on your sessions and your matches in real time, as opposed to the common practice of reflecting on your training sessions after they have finished or after your matches have finished, which will be more beneficial to your players. It will improve you as a coach quicker, and it will also improve the sessions for those players. As a coach, you do become more self-aware. You're constantly asking yourself, why am I doing this? Am I happy with what I'm doing? Do I need to change anything? So you're improving yourself constantly as a coach. Also, by listening back, you can hear how you're communicating to everyone. Is there a difference in your communication style on match days where it might be deemed as a more pressurized environment? Or is your communication style just the same as what it is in training? So it's very valuable to that, to listen back to yourself in context of a football match and in training sessions. I also find it useful to hear the questions that the players were asking during your sessions or during your matches. It gives you a greater insight into who's asking the questions, and maybe that they're not understanding your communication style, and then you can adjust that accordingly, which then will improve that session for that player. It can be used in so many different ways, but you definitely do improve in many different areas as a coach. For me, I did find it more time efficient, because I was able to reflect during the sessions, during matches. You were able to make the changes there and then. By recording what's happening, when you go back to reflect on your matches and your training sessions, you don't have to worry about forgetting anything, because it's all been recorded. You can listen to it at a later time. We all don't have the luxury of being able to sit down straight away after our sessions and analyse what has just happened. It's just not practical sometimes. So with this being recorded, you can then look back at a later date. You can listen to it in your car on the way home. You can listen to it while you're doing other mundane tasks, maybe around the house. So I do find Think Aloud process is very effective. It's very time efficient. And I do find it a simple but very effective tool for coaches. And I would highly recommend any coach to try it.
I didn't pay Fiona to say that, by the way. She give us that information off her own back. Okay, so that's kind of me for today's session. I've noticed a couple of people asking about kind of the papers and the research. So there's a couple of kind of references from some of the work that I've mentioned. There's a couple of book chapters in there too. So I don't know if any, I know this is being kind of shared later on. So there's some references there. And then from a kind of an athlete perspective, there's some references there in terms of some of the work I've talked about today, from cycling, golf, gymnastics judging. There's a paper there that we've done in Australian rules kicking as well. So back over to Eric, and I think we've got time for some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amy. That was amazing. Lots of positive messages in the chat flowing. So we do have time for some questions. So if you do have a question, please use the session chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. First question is, how can the Think Aloud tool be adapted for someone with a physical disability, for example, hearing impairment?
Yeah, great question. And a student asked me that today as well, to be honest. So that is difficult. One of the things that we've done previously when I've been working with coaches is that a coach with a hearing impairment has had a signer with them. So they've signed to the signer, and then the signer has verbalized kind of their signed thoughts, if that makes sense. without the luxury of that, that's a difficult thing. And also, I'd be super interested to hear anyone's kind of thoughts or recommendations on that, because I do think it's a really important thing that we need to consider.
Yeah, for sure. Next question is, how does the Think Aloud tool work differently for team sports versus individual sports?
From an athlete perspective or from a coach perspective? I'd tell you what, I'll answer kind of both. From an athlete perspective, it is difficult to mic up kind of players in a team-based sport that are, you know, high intensity, physical. We've been able to mic up kind of soccer goalkeepers during matches with some kind of lighter technology, so we can get their Think Aloud processes while they're off the ball. And then I've worked with coaches where we've set up drills to kind of, which are slower and might involve kind of different elements that allow time for Think Aloud to happen. So we wouldn't expect an athlete to verbalize their thoughts kind of during a tackle or a one-on-one situation. Whereas obviously in an individual sport, it's much easier. And there's that time available to use Think Aloud. So in cricket, for example, it was before kind of batting and bowling. In tennis, it was between points. And obviously within cycling, it was they're on their own, so they're able to do that. And then golf, again, you can see the examples there. But I think from a coaching perspective, there's not really that much difference. It's just about the proximity to the athlete that you're working with. So if you are working in a one-to-one environment with an athlete, always obviously step back where possible. But I think that there isn't too much difference in terms of how we use Think Aloud from a coaching perspective there.
Awesome. Are coaches reluctant to use the Think Aloud tool at first?
So I've had a really positive experience with the coaches that I work with. And I think because I get asked to come and run these programs, usually they've like heard a podcast, or someone's just mentioned like the Sports Psych Show, or there's a rugby union podcast that I did recently, the Magic Academy. So they've kind of heard it already from kind of somebody else, and them kind of coaches are kind of eager to learn and to have a go. But then if coaches aren't aware of it before they come to the workshop, there is always kind of, I get this kind of body language, like arms crossed, I get funny looks, and I can tell that they're a little bit uncomfortable with the prospect of thinking aloud. But my kind of approach is just try it and let me know. And you don't have to share your audio with me, because I think that's always the uncomfortable thing. And I think once we get over that hurdle, then they kind of see the benefits. So then they kind of really jump on board with the process.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so the final question actually talks about or asking about the benefits. So in team sports, have you seen an increase in either the quantity or quality of communication between players as a result of the Think Aloud practices?
Between players, so we haven't actually measured that, but I think that from a research perspective, that would be awesome to do. From a kind of my experience perspective, what we've noticed more from a coach and athlete communication is a huge improvement. So especially when we've focused on autonomy supportive coaching with the coaches, and getting the coaches to really think about how they interact, how they allow input from the athletes themselves and the players. And also, I guess this does link to this question, by allowing more autonomy with the players and the team, that will improve communication, and it will improve kind of possibly team cohesion. But I can't say that we've studied that, and we don't have any concrete evidence. It's just kind of my experiences.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you for attending, everyone. The next session of OCC21 takes place tonight at 7 p.m. with best-selling author, acclaimed human performance, team culture, and leadership consultant, Alistair McCaw. Be sure to also check out the networking tab on the left menu, and you can start meeting new friends from across Canada. Send a private message, start a video call, or even start your own group discussion, all conference long. See you at the next session.